Good morning. This is from John 19. The passages are 1 through 30. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin."
You know, we could have gone with Mark's gospel. We could have gone with the gospel that's not so, it seems, overtly anti-Semitic. But we don't shy away from the nasty bits in the Bible at Trinity-St. Paul's. No, we deal with them head on, and that's what we're going to do this morning. Because you can't help but hear the visceral hatred in John of what he calls with such distaste the Jews. It's dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous. It's been dangerous for thousands of years. And when we think about our forebears like Martin Luther, the great reformer, who wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies, a pamphlet that inspired the Third Reich, if you can call it inspiration, and which channeled the anti-Semitism which he knew from his own historical period and which had been there for thousands of years before. In fact, the Bible itself is a story of people hating the Jews from the beginning of time, their overcoming of oppression and then their re-oppression again. Jesus the Jew grew up in a Palestine that was occupied by the Roman Empire, one of the most notorious and horrible of all time. And one can't say it loudly enough, the John who wrote these words was a Jew. John wrote these words about a family feud, a feud he was having with those who called themselves Jewish at the time, not unlike some of the feuds we've had in the Christian church. But it's clear in the New Testament that the entire New Testament is about justifying Jesus as part of the lineage of Judah and David, as a Jew, as a rabbi, as a Messiah in that tradition. Unfortunately, that family feud became the justification for the killing of millions. I grew up just around the corner from here on Bedford Road. Wasn't she back then? My parents ran a rooming house. In this, our annex in Toronto, and this area is rich with the history of Jewish immigration and the history of Canadian anti-Semitism. Spadina was all Jewish in my day, and my best friend at Huron Public School's name was Helen Belosky. She was Jewish too. And we grew up knowing that Belosky and De Novo were not the names you wanted to have in the city of Toronto. She was called a kike, and I was called a wop. And as little kids, we didn't even know what those words meant, but we knew that there was something wrong with us that wasn't wrong with the kids with the last names that were Williams or Wilson or James. My Italian relatives came from Sicily, and we knew that the Roman Empire was evil because they occupied Sicily too, and Helen knew about the Roman Empire being evil too. What we came to learn as kids was the stories of Canada. My father told me how he, as an Italian, was only allowed in the back door of this prestigious granite club, not in the front. But, he told me, Jews weren't allowed in at all, not until the 1970s. He witnessed riots between Nazis and Nazi supporters and Jews and their supporters in Christie Pitts, which is just a few blocks from here. He remembers a sign on the boardwalk in the East End of Toronto that said, "No Jews, no dogs." And he remembers how Massey Hall in 1939 was filled to the rafters, standing room only, for a fascist rally. He also remembers how the MSS St. Louis was refused to dock in Canada because it carried 900 Jews who wanted to come here for safety. And the immigration official said, even one is too many. About 25% of those 900 went back to die in the camps. And how the University of Toronto, that's only blocks from here too, had a quota on how many Jews were let in, and that was right up until the 1950s. It was perfectly legal for most of my dad's life to not hire because you were Jewish, to fire because you were Jewish and found out, to refuse to rent to refuse to sell to, etc. And anti-Semitism truly was the prototype for Islamophobia. It was here first. It paved the way. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it best before he was executed in Germany for resisting the fascist church, the Nazi church. He wrote, "The most important message of my day for a Christian minister to preach is this one: Jesus was a Jew." As we listen to these words of John, let's not listen to the hatred. Let's try to hear the wisdom.
From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was a day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor."
Let's take a minute to consider my friend Annabelle. A lovely, vibrant trans woman in her late 20s. Pardon me, just a little frog in my throat. Pardon. I've known her for about 10 years and watched her go from a bright spark in anyone's day to destroyed, shattered, and near death. That's right. We are here today, and she may not be tomorrow. Let's look at what happened to Annabelle and our involvement in her ruin. How did she go from dancing down the street with a beaming smile to a hobbled gait, clothed in rags, shattered teeth, shunned? Like Jesus, she was arrested on trumped-up charge. In her case, possessing drugs. Nearly all trans women battle with the misuse of substances. For many, it is the only thing keeping them alive and sane. So Annabelle was arrested, charged, and convicted. Like Jesus, the judges didn't want to throw her into jail, for they knew what happened to trans women in jail. They were treated terribly, forced into sexual slavery, and they did not want this to happen to her. But without support, she was released and rearrested, this time sentenced to jail for a short time, nothing too serious. And again, released, unsupported, rearrested, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years plus a day in federal jail. Hard time. What remains of her today is what we have allowed to happen. She still needs help. And she is more than her peers can manage. So she will die before she is 40. The upper median age for a trans woman in the city of Toronto is 46, not 86, like it would be for anyone else. It's half a lifetime. And it's a reflection upon us that trans lives are cut short. They die of indifference. Thank you.
Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots."
Ableism fundamentally is a denial of the diversity that is God's creation. I don't need to be healed. I'm not ill. And I certainly don't need to be exalted. Heal the structures that exclude me. Exalt the attitudes that see me as a social worker, a lover, and an uncle who just happens to be in a chair.
And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home.
In Ontario, about 22% of jobs can be characterized as precarious, which is defined as low wages and at least 2 of the following 3 criteria: no pension, no union and/or small firm size, and at least this is slightly better than the Canada-wide rate of about 30%. But unsurprisingly, the demographics that are most likely to be involuntarily precariously employed are those who are already marginalized, meaning women, racialized individuals, recent immigrants, and the effects compounding for those with intersectional identities, for example, Indigenous women. It's just hearing Sherry speak earlier about, depending on your race, being able to be fired or not hired in the first place, being Jewish, that we still today have a modern version of this that kind of gets swept under the rug, that we think we have laws that protect against this happening when that isn't quite the case. And this is a reality that I have to face as being still a youth and queer and a person of color, occupying a very white space in my chosen profession at the moment. And recognizing that what I need to accomplish from those intersectional identities just to receive the same benefits offered to so many others.
After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.